1. Catherine Birnie. Catherine Margaret Birnie was born on May 23, 1951, in Perth, Western Australia. By the mid-1980s, she would become one half of the country's most notorious killing couple. Alongside her partner, David Birnie, she was responsible for a series of abductions and murders that became known as the Moorhouse Street Killings. Catherine today remains behind bars at Bandyup Women's Prison, serving a life sentence with no prospect of release. Catherine's early life was marked by disruption. Her mother died in childbirth when she was just 2, and she was sent to live with relatives before rejoining her father at the age of 10. People who knew her as a child described her as serious and withdrawn. By her teenage years, she met David Birnie, 2 years older, with a troubled background and a disturbing fascination with violence. Their relationship was intense and toxic. And though Catherine later married another man and had 7 children, she returned to David after his release from prison in the early 1980s. From then on, her life and identity became fused with his in both love and crime. Their crimes began in October 1986. Their first known victim was Mary Nielsen, a 22-year-old university student lured to the Birnie house by a fake advertisement for cheap car tires. She was abducted, restrained, and later killed. Days later, the couple targeted Susanna Candy, a 15-year-old schoolgirl. She was kept alive for days, subjected to control and cruelty before Catherine herself gave the signal for David to end her life. The next victims followed the same pattern: Erin Patterson, 31, whose car broke down by the roadside, and Denise Brown, a 21-year-old woman walking home from work. Each was abducted, taken to the house, bound, assaulted, and murdered. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves in Gleneagle State Forest. The pattern was chillingly methodical. Catherine wasn't a passive observer. She helped prepare the house, lure the victims, restrain them, and in some cases participated directly in their deaths. There was no break and no sign of remorse. The plan was to keep going until they were stopped. That moment came on November 10, 1986, when they abducted Kate Maher, a 17-year-old girl who had missed her bus home and accepted a ride from the Birnies. Unlike the others, Kate stayed calm and observant, memorizing details of the car, the house, and the couple. After being chained to the bed overnight, she seized a chance to escape when Catherine left the room and David was distracted. She fled barefoot, still bound, to a neighbor's house. The neighbors called police, and her testimony would end the killing spree. When investigators entered the Birnie home, they found ropes, chains, and belongings of the victims. Catherine initially denied involvement, but faced with Kate's detailed account, the physical evidence, and David's confession, she admitted her role. Witnesses described her in custody as cold and clinical, answering questions with facts, but showing no emotion. Psychiatrists struggled to define her. Some said she was deeply submissive to David. Others concluded she shared his violent impulses and acted willingly. What became clear was that Catherine was no victim of coercion. She had participated fully and deliberately. In 1987, Catherine and David Birnie were both sentenced to life imprisonment with no parole. David later took his own life in 2005, inside Casuarina prison. Catherine, however, remains alive, now in her 70s, and continues to serve her sentence at Bandyup Women's Prison. Over the years, she has applied for parole multiple times, each attempt sparking outrage and renewed pain for the victims' families. Every application has been denied, with judges concluding that she remains a danger to the community and has shown no genuine remorse. The case of Catherine Birnie stands as one of Australia's darkest reminders that evil doesn't always appear in obvious forms. She wasn't desperate, hysterical, or visibly unstable. She was methodical, calculating, and quiet. It is easy to imagine killers as loud and chaotic, but Catherine Birnie shows us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who blend into ordinary suburban life, hidden behind a calm face and a deadly partnership. Jemma Lilley Trudi Lenon. On the morning of June 13, 2016, Erin Pajich, a 17-year-old boy from Mandorah, Western Australia, was reported missing by his mother. Erin was gentle, trusting, and diagnosed with autism. He lived a predictable, structured life, and when he failed to return home from meeting a friend, his family knew instantly that something was wrong. For 2 weeks, police searched tirelessly. They reviewed CCTV footage, interviewed friends, and knocked on doors. What they eventually uncovered would shock even seasoned investigators, a murder driven not by money or jealousy, but by fantasy. Erin's background was that of a quiet teenager who loved video games and computers. He was careful about who he spent time with, but he longed for friendship. That longing made him vulnerable to people who didn't see him as a person, but as a target. The 2 women who would betray his trust seemed ordinary. Trudi Lenon, 43, was a single mother of 3, known in her community for school pickups and Facebook parenting groups. Her housemate, Jemma Lilley, 25, had moved to Australia from the UK, worked in a tattoo parlor, and was obsessed with horror fiction. Behind closed doors, their lives were consumed by disturbing role-play, sadistic online communities, and a shared fantasy that blurred dangerously into reality. Jemma Lilley, in particular, was fixated on becoming a killer. She idolized serial murderers and even published a violent novel titled Playzone under the name SOS, her fictional alter ego. Friends recalled her speaking casually about wanting to kill someone before she turned 26. Trudi, more submissive in personality, became her eager accomplice, feeding Jemma's fantasies and helping turn them into action. The 2 bonded over their shared interest in domination and cruelty, forming a partnership built on dangerous obsession. On June 13th, Trudi lured Erin to her house under the pretense of playing computer games with her son. Once inside, he was led into a room that had been prepared in advance. Plastic sheets covered the floor. Knives were sharpened and waiting. What followed was brutal. Jemma attacked Erin from behind, stabbing him repeatedly while Trudi restrained him. The assault was swift and merciless. When it was over, they wrapped his body in plastic, buried him in the backyard, and covered the grave with concrete slabs and potted plants. The next day, Jemma went to work at the tattoo shop, while Trudi picked up her children from school, as if nothing had happened. The investigation gained momentum when CCTV footage showed Erin walking with Trudi outside a local Woolworths just hours before his disappearance. Detectives quickly focused on her and discovered she lived with Jemma. A search warrant on the property revealed cleaning supplies out of place, traces of blood, and freshly laid concrete in the garden. Forensic tests confirmed it was Erin. Inside Jemma's bedroom, investigators found violent sketches, posters of infamous killers, and her self-published novel detailing torture and murder. Detectives testified that Jemma treated Erin's death like a box to tick, an act to complete her fantasy of becoming her alter ego, SOS. The trial in 2017 laid bare the chilling dynamic between the 2 women. Prosecutors described Trudi as the submissive partner, desperate for Jemma's approval, while Jemma was the driving force, detached and narcissistic. In police interviews, Jemma showed little emotion and at one point chillingly remarked, "It had to be done." Both women denied involvement at first, but the evidence was overwhelming. CCTV, forensic testing, and Trudi's ties to Erin all linked them directly to the crime. They were each convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 28 years before parole. Both are currently incarcerated at Bandyup Women's Prison, the same maximum security facility that houses Catherine Birnie. Prison officials have kept them separated, citing the danger of their continued association. For Erin's family, the pain has never left. His mother, Sharon, has spoken sparingly to the media, remembering her son as a boy who loved music, laughter, and the comfort of his routines. She describes him as gentle, trusting, and undeserving of such cruelty. The case of Jemma Lilley and Trudi Lenon is haunting not just because of its brutality, but because of its ordinariness. These women weren't living on society's fringes. They had jobs, children, and everyday routines. Yet behind closed doors, they cultivated a fantasy world where human life became disposable. For Erin Pajich, trust proved fatal. He thought he was meeting a friend. Instead, he stepped into a trap designed by women who saw him not as a person, but as an object to fulfill a dark ambition. 3. Singh. On October 26, 1997, paramedics arrived at a suburban home in Downer, Canberra, to find 26-year-old Joe Cinque lying motionless in bed. His pupils were fixed, there were no signs of life. His girlfriend, Singh, a 25-year-old law student at the Australian National University, had calmly placed the emergency call. She told them Jo wasn't breathing, but her demeanor was strangely detached. What appeared at first to be a sudden illness would soon unravel into one of Australia's most disturbing cases of betrayal, obsession, and premeditated murder. Anu Singh's background seemed respectable on the surface. She was articulate, ambitious, and came from an academic family. Her father a doctor, her mother a professor. She was seen as intelligent, if aloof, by classmates. But beneath the polished image, she was spiraling. Friends noticed her obsession with her health, her appearance, and her belief that something was physically wrong with her body. She often spoke about feeling she was dying, and in her growing delusion, she began telling people she couldn't leave the world alone. If she died, she said, Jo had to die with her. Jo Cinque was everything Anu was not. He was kind, warm, and well-liked. A civil engineering graduate from Newcastle, he came from a close Italian-Australian family. Friends noticed how isolated he became as his relationship with Anu deepened. She controlled what he ate, where he went, and who he spoke to. Jo's loyalty and trust became his vulnerability. By late 1997, Anu had moved from disturbing talk into deadly planning. She obtained Rohypnol, a sedative, and heroin, despite having no prior history of drug use. She confided her intentions to her friend and fellow law student Madhavi Rao, and even hosted what she called a farewell dinner in the days leading up to Jo's death. Guests recalled her speaking openly about wanting to die and take Jo with her. Most dismissed it as strange dramatics. Some thought it was a cry for help. But no one called the police. On the night of October 25, 1997, Singh cooked Jo his favorite pasta meal. His drink was laced with Rohypnol. While sedated, he was injected with heroin, a fatal dose. He never woke up. As Jo lay dying, Singh and Rao did not call for immediate help. They delayed contacting an ambulance until it was far too late, even providing the wrong address at first. By the time paramedics arrived, Jo was already gone. The investigation revealed just how deliberate the act had been. Toxicology confirmed both Rohypnol and heroin in Jo's system. Diary entries and notes in Singh's handwriting laid out her plans in chilling detail. Witnesses testified that she had openly discussed killing Jo for weeks. Madhavi Rao admitted helping procure the heroin but was later acquitted at trial. Singh herself admitted injecting Jo, but claimed her mental state at the time made her incapable of fully understanding what she was doing. In 1999, Anu Singh was found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, after the court accepted psychiatric assessments diagnosing her with borderline personality disorder, narcissistic traits, and depression. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with a minimum of 4 years before parole. She served just that minimum, walking free in 2001. The verdict devastated Jo's family, who believed justice had not been served for the deliberate and premeditated nature of his death. After her release, Singh attempted to rebuild her life, even pursuing postgraduate studies in criminology. She occasionally made public statements about mental illness and rehabilitation, portraying her crime as a result of psychological collapse. To Jo's mother, Maria Cinque, this was deeply painful. She remained vocal, publishing a book in 2004 titled Jo Cinque's Consolation, which chronicled the family's grief and their belief that the legal system had failed them. The book was later adapted into a 2016 film, reigniting public debate about the case. The tragedy of Jo Cinque's death lies not only in the crime itself, but in the silence of those who knew. Friends and acquaintances had heard Singh speak about her plan. Some even saw her prepare for it, yet no one intervened. Jo trusted the woman he loved. He believed he was safe, and that trust was used as the very weapon that ended his life. 4. Martha Needle. In the late 19th century, Melbourne was a growing city of opportunity, but also a place where hidden crimes could easily escape scrutiny. Among its quiet working-class streets lived Martha Needle, a woman whose name would soon become synonymous with cold-blooded poisonings. By the time her crimes were uncovered in 1894, 3 of her family members were dead, and a disturbing pattern of deliberate arsenic use had emerged. Martha Needle's background seemed ordinary on the surface. Born in Morgan, South Australia in 1863, she was raised in a family marked by hardship. Neighbors would later describe her as a hard-working woman, quiet and devoted to her home. By her early 20s, she married Henry Needle, a laborer, and together, they had 3 young daughters. But behind the domestic image lay a darker reality. Financial stress, marital strain, and Martha's growing willingness to resort to deadly methods. Her crimes began with the sudden illnesses and deaths of her own family. In 1885, her husband Henry fell violently ill with symptoms of painful stomach cramps, vomiting, and weakness. Doctors at the time attributed it to natural causes. Within 3 years, the same fate befell her 3 daughters, Elsie, May, and Maud, all dying under suspiciously similar circumstances. Each death was marked by the same agonizing symptoms, yet no one raised serious alarm. Sympathy poured in for Martha, seen as a grieving widow and mother, but suspicion quietly lingered. Years later, Martha entered into a new relationship with a man named Louis Junkin. He was engaged to Martha, but his extended family strongly disapproved. When Louis's brother, Otto, suddenly became ill and died in 1894, doctors began to take notice. Soon after, another Junkin brother, Herman, fell gravely sick with nearly identical symptoms. This time, medical authorities ordered an autopsy. The results confirmed what had long been overlooked: arsenic poisoning. The investigation turned quickly toward Martha. Detectives learned she had purchased Rough on Rats, an arsenic-based poison, on several occasions. Exhumations of her husband and daughters revealed the same traces of arsenic. Witnesses recalled her calmly administering meals and medicines, often insisting she alone tend to the sick. Neighbors remembered her composure during the funerals, noting she seemed less grief-stricken than expected. The pattern was undeniable. Wherever Martha lived, death followed in quiet succession. Her trial in 1894 gripped Melbourne. The press labeled her the Black Widow and the Richmond Poisoner. Prosecutors argued that Martha killed for financial gain, collecting small insurance payouts and removing those who stood in the way of her new relationship. The evidence was overwhelming: arsenic residues, suspicious purchases, and a string of family deaths too similar to dismiss. Her defense claimed she was a victim of circumstance, but the jury took less than an hour to reach a verdict. Martha Needle was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. On October 22, 1894, she was executed by hanging at the Old Melbourne Gaol. Witnesses reported that she walked calmly to the gallows, showing little outward fear. She became one of the few women executed in Victoria's history, her case leaving behind a chilling legacy. The reflection is as unsettling today as it was then. Martha Needle didn't kill strangers in sudden acts of rage. She killed those closest to her: her husband, her children, and her partner's family, slowly, methodically, and with poison hidden in food and medicine. She wore the mask of a caregiver, even as she was the source of their suffering. Her case exposed how, in an era without advanced forensic science, trust itself could become the deadliest weapon. 5. Martha Rendell. On February 6, 1909, a crowd gathered outside Perth Gaol in Western Australia. Inside, Martha Rendell, a 41-year-old stepmother, walked calmly to the gallows. Within minutes, she became the first and only woman ever executed in Western Australia. Her crime shocked the nation, not just because of its brutality, but because of the victim she chose. The people she was supposed to protect, her stepchildren. Martha Rendell's background was that of a woman struggling against social judgment. Born in South Australia in 1871, she later entered a relationship with widower Thomas Morris William Rendell, who had several young children from his previous marriage. Because William and Martha were not legally married, society viewed them with suspicion, and neighbors whispered about their living arrangements. Despite this, Martha assumed the role of stepmother, presenting herself as devoted, orderly, and compliant. But within the walls of their modest home, a far darker truth unfolded. Beginning in 1907, the Rendell household was struck by a series of illnesses. Annie, 8 years old, fell sick with painful throat infections. Struggling to breathe, she died after weeks of agony. Months later, her younger sister Olive, 6, developed the same mysterious symptoms: difficulty swallowing, burning pain, and slow suffocation. She too died. Finally, in 1908, Arthur, just 14, succumbed to the same illness. 3 children dead in less than 2 years, all with eerily similar symptoms. Doctors initially suspected diphtheria, but whispers of foul play began to spread. The investigation began when a local doctor raised doubts. He noted the symptoms didn't match common illnesses, and when another neighbor revealed that Martha often administered medicine herself, suspicion grew. A search of the house revealed bottles of hydrochloric acid, ostensibly a household cleaning agent. Witnesses later testified that Martha had been seen painting the children's throats with the solution, claiming it was a remedy for sore throats. In truth, it was poisoning them slowly, burning their mouths and lungs until they could no longer survive. The surviving children described her cold detachment. They recalled how she forced them to take the so-called medicine, ignoring their screams and pleas. Neighbors remembered her calm demeanor during the funerals, noting that while others wept, she remained composed. Forensic testing of the children's remains revealed traces consistent with acid burns, confirming deliberate poisoning. Her trial in July 1909 was sensational. Newspapers branded her the Scarlet Woman of Perth, casting her as a symbol of unnatural female evil. Prosecutors presented the evidence of repeated poisonings, the exhumed bodies, and eyewitness accounts of her administering acid to the children's throats. Martha denied intent, insisting she only sought to cure their ailments, but the jury took just over an hour to find her guilty of murder. On October 6, 1909, Martha Rendell was hanged at Perth Gaol. Reports state she walked steadily to the gallows, refusing sedatives and speaking no last words. Outside, hundreds gathered in silence as the trapdoor opened. She was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds, alongside male prisoners executed before her. The reflection of her case has lingered for more than a century. Some historians later questioned whether Martha was demonized more harshly because she was a woman living in a de facto relationship, already scorned by society. Others argue the evidence left little doubt. What remains certain is the legacy of betrayal. Children who trusted a caregiver poisoned slowly under the guise of love. Martha Rendell's name is remembered not just as a murderer, but as a reminder of how evil can hide behind the quiet mask of domestic duty. 6. Erin Patterson. On July 29, 2023, a quiet family lunch in the rural Victorian town of Leongatha turned into one of the most high-profile murder cases Australia had ever seen. Erin Patterson, a 48-year-old mother, had invited her former in-laws, Dawn and Gail Patterson, and Gail's sister Heather Wilkinson with her husband Ian for a Sunday meal. The centerpiece was homemade beef Wellington, served with mashed potatoes and green beans. Within 24 hours, all 4 guests were violently ill with symptoms resembling food poisoning. By the end of the week, 3 of them were dead. Only Ian Wilkinson survived after weeks in intensive care. Erin's background seemed unremarkable. She was known locally as a homemaker, a devoted mother raising 2 children while separated from her husband, Simon Patterson. Neighbors described her as polite and quiet. Online, she participated in community groups and even true crime discussions. To most, she appeared like any ordinary woman living in small-town Australia. But suspicion soon turned her into a national headline. The crime centered on what was inside the beef Wellington. Toxicology tests revealed that the mushrooms used in the dish were Amanita phalloides, commonly known as death cap mushrooms, one of the most lethal fungi in the world. Consuming even a small amount can cause irreversible liver damage and death. Erin herself reported feeling ill after the meal, but declined hospital treatment, discharging herself against doctors' advice. Police later noted that her symptoms were mild compared to those suffered by her guests. The investigation quickly intensified. Detectives discovered that Erin had discarded a food dehydrator at a local rubbish tip shortly after the lunch. When recovered, it tested positive for traces of death cap mushrooms, and her fingerprints were found on it. Investigators also noted a troubling detail. The guests' meals were served on gray plates, while Erin's portion was plated separately. In addition, computer searches on her devices revealed queries about toxic mushrooms, undercutting her claim that the deaths were a tragic accident caused by confusion between store-bought and foraged fungi. Her relationship with her estranged husband also fueled speculation about motive. Though Simon was not at the lunch, their marriage had been marked by tension. and Erin had previously claimed false health conditions to cover her struggles with self-image. Prosecutors alleged she had orchestrated the meal deliberately, while Erin insisted it was nothing more than a horrible mistake. The trial began in 2024 and lasted for more than 9 weeks. Prosecutors argued Erin knowingly served a deadly dish, pointing to the discarded dehydrator, internet searches, and her selective illness as evidence of intent. The defense countered that she had no motive to kill her in-laws, describing her as overwhelmed and misunderstood. On October 2024, after 6 days of jury deliberation, Erin Patterson was found guilty of 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. She now awaits formal sentencing, with prosecutors seeking life imprisonment. The case captivated Australia because it was unlike typical acts of violence. There was no weapon, no dramatic confrontation, just a meal served around a family table. 3 people lost their lives in silence, poisoned by food they believed was prepared with care. The reflection is chilling. The Erin Patterson case reminds us that betrayal doesn't always come with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it arrives at the dinner table, hidden in what looks like hospitality. Trust became the entry point for destruction, and the ordinary act of sharing a meal turned into one of the deadliest tragedies in modern Australian history. 7. Belinda Colbran. On a quiet evening in 2016 in the Tasmanian suburb of Newnham, police responded to reports of a man stumbling into a neighbor's yard, drenched in blood. That man was 22-year-old Aaron Monaco, and despite desperate attempts to save him, he died from multiple stab wounds. The brutal killing shocked the community, not only for its violence but for the unlikely perpetrators. Belinda Leon Colbran, a woman known locally as quiet and ordinary, and her partner, Nathan Smith. Belinda's background gave little hint of what was to come. In her mid-30s, she lived a relatively low-profile life with Smith. To neighbors she was polite and unremarkable, blending into the background of suburban Tasmania. There were no major warning signs of violence, no public record of serious crime. Yet beneath the surface, her relationship with Nathan was troubled. And together they would commit a murder that left family and friends searching for answers. The crime unfolded on the night of Aaron's death. He was attacked in his own home, stabbed 6 times in a frenzied assault that left him fatally wounded. Somehow he managed to stagger to a neighbor's house seeking help before collapsing. Paramedics were called, but the injuries were too severe. The brutality of the attack was undeniable. It was up close, personal, and deliberate. The investigation quickly linked the crime to Colbran and Smith. CCTV footage, phone records, and forensic evidence placed the pair near Aaron's home that evening. Detectives pieced together the timeline. The couple had confronted Aaron, and the confrontation escalated to lethal violence. Though the precise motive was never made fully clear, prosecutors suggested personal disputes and toxic relationship dynamics between the 3. When questioned, Belinda appeared calm, even smiling briefly in court when glancing at her partner, an image that later haunted observers. The trial in 2018 laid out the case in detail. Witness testimony, forensic findings, and the couple's movements in the lead-up to the murder left little room for doubt. Both Belinda Colbran and Nathan Smith were found guilty of murdering Aaron Monaco. The judge described the attack as callous and deliberate, emphasizing the cruelty of their actions and the absence of remorse. Each was sentenced to 24 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 13 years. Belinda chose not to appeal her conviction, finalizing her fate. For Aaron's family, the sentencing brought little comfort. His sister delivered a devastating victim impact statement in court, describing the grief and emptiness left behind. Aaron had been young, with his future still ahead of him, and his life was cut short in the most senseless way. The reflection of this case is disturbing, not just for the violence, but for the absence of answers. Unlike crimes driven by money or jealousy, the murder of Aaron Monaco seemed to stem from broken relationships and reckless choices. Belinda Colbran was not a woman many would have suspected of such brutality, yet she played a central role in ending an innocent life. Today, she serves her sentence in a Tasmanian prison, while Aaron's family continues to live with the quiet, unanswerable question of why. 8. Natalie Maher. In early 2019, The quiet Hobart suburb of Sandy Bay, Tasmania, was shaken by a crime that seemed almost unimaginable. 71-year-old Veronica Cotterfine, a well-known church member and community volunteer, was found dead in her home. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a break-in. Suspicion quickly turned inward, to the one person closest to her. Her daughter, Natalie Maher, a 46-year-old former law student who had lived with her mother for years, calmly admitted to smothering her as she slept. Natalie's background was far from typical for someone who would commit such a crime. Educated, intelligent, and articulate, she had once studied law and was seen as capable and private. For decades she lived with her mother, taking on the role of carer as Veronica's health declined. To outsiders this arrangement appeared dutiful, even admirable, a devoted daughter caring for her aging mother. But behind closed doors, the burden of caregiving was eroding her mentally and emotionally. Natalie became increasingly withdrawn, rarely leaving the house, her entire life revolving around her mother's needs. The crime occurred late one night in their shared home. Natalie later confessed that as Veronica slept, she pressed a pillow over her face until she stopped breathing. There was no loud confrontation, no weapon, no visible struggle. It was a quiet, deliberate act, carried out in silence. When she later called authorities, she was composed, reporting her mother's death as if it had been peaceful. But the autopsy revealed the truth: deliberate suffocation. The investigation painted a tragic portrait of emotional collapse. Detectives discovered no signs of financial motive, no history of abuse, and no premeditated plan beyond Natalie's exhaustion. When questioned, she admitted calmly that she felt trapped and saw no end to the endless cycle of care. She said she had been overwhelmed, isolated, and numb. Her lack of panic and her quiet confession shocked investigators almost as much as the crime itself. In court later that year, Natalie pleaded guilty to murder. The judge acknowledged her years of devotion as a carer, her clean record, and the psychological weight of her isolation. But he emphasized the severity of the act, the deliberate killing of her own mother, someone who trusted her completely. Natalie Maher was sentenced to 23 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 13 years. There was no dramatic trial, no appeals, no further public statements. Natalie vanished into the prison system as quietly as she had lived her life. Today, she serves her sentence in Tasmania's Mary Hutchinson Women's Prison. The reflection of this case is unsettling, because it wasn't fueled by greed, jealousy, or even rage. It was born of silence, isolation, and emotional collapse. Natalie Maher didn't fit the profile of a violent criminal. She wasn't outwardly abusive, and she wasn't visibly unstable. But years of hidden strain pushed her past a line she could never return from. Her crime is a reminder of how invisible pressures can break even those who seem most composed, and how the darkest tragedies can happen not in alleys or streets, but quietly in the very rooms we think of as safe. 9. Noelene June Jordan. On May 23, 2009, the stillness of a suburban street in Lauderdale, Tasmania, was shattered by gunfire. Shane Barker, a 45-year-old father, was found slumped near his car in the driveway of his home. He had been shot multiple times at close range. What police uncovered in the days that followed would reveal a shocking truth. The people behind the ambush weren't strangers or criminals from the underworld. They were family, his former in-laws. At the center of the plot was Noelene June Jordan, a 68-year-old grandmother and respected churchgoer. Noelene's background gave no sign of violence. She was a devout Christian, polite, and well-regarded in her community. She lived a quiet life with her husband, Graham, in a modest Tasmanian home. To neighbors and friends, she embodied traditional values, a grandmother who attended church and minded her own business. But behind the surface, years of bitterness and resentment toward her daughter's ex-husband had been festering, and in 2009 it would erupt into murder. The crime was calculated. For years, Shane's relationship with the Jordan family had been tense and hostile, marked by disputes over his failed marriage and ongoing bitterness about custody arrangements. By May 2009, Noelene and Graham decided to take matters into their own hands. They obtained a firearm illegally, tracked Shane's movements, and chose the moment to strike. On that cold morning, as Shane prepared to leave for work, the couple lay in wait. Multiple shots were fired. Shane collapsed in his driveway, fatally wounded before he could escape. The investigation focused quickly on the Jordans. Police recovered the weapon, tied surveillance evidence to their movements, and uncovered records showing weeks of planning. Forensic analysis linked them to the shooting, and witnesses confirmed the long-standing hostility between the family and Shane. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was deliberate, organized, and personal. But the legal process dragged on. For over a decade, procedural delays and legal complexities kept the case unresolved. It wasn't until 2023, 14 years after the murder, that the matter was finally brought to a conclusion. By then, Noelene was 82 years old, a frail woman in the dock, facing justice for a crime she had committed decades earlier. The verdict was clear. Noelene June Jordan was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 22 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 12 years. Her husband Graham received the same sentence. Given their advanced age, it is unlikely either will live long enough to see freedom again. Noelene now serves her time in Tasmania's Mary Hutchinson Women's Prison. The reflection of her case is one of betrayal and transformation. Here was a woman who lived almost her entire life within the boundaries of respectability, raising children, attending church, and earning the trust of her community. Yet beneath that ordinary exterior, resentment and anger grew unchecked until she crossed the line between victim and vigilante, taking justice into her own hands. The murder of Shane Barker is remembered not just for its violence, but for who carried it out. A grandmother, a churchgoer, someone who looked ordinary until the moment she chose to become judge, jury, and executioner. 10. Annette Hancock. On the night of March 9, 2022, police were called to a modest housing unit on Harrington Street in Hobart, Tasmania. Inside, they discovered the body of 51-year-old Benjamin Harris, lying motionless from a single but devastating stab wound. The woman who admitted responsibility was his partner, Annette Louise Ruth Hancock, a 56-year-old Tasmanian woman whose long struggle with alcohol, mental health, and a turbulent relationship ended in sudden violence. Annette's background was marked by instability. She had a history of personal hardship, housing insecurity, and breaches of family violence orders linked to her relationship with Harris. Friends and neighbors saw her as vulnerable, often struggling with alcohol dependency and emotional volatility. Yet no one imagined she would cross the line into murder. The crime unfolded after a night of heavy drinking. According to court records, Harris had admitted infidelity during an argument, taunting Annette by comparing her unfavorably to another woman. Fueled by alcohol, emotional turmoil, and a sense of betrayal, Annette snapped. In a moment of rage, she seized a kitchen knife and stabbed Harris once in the back. The blade penetrated between his vertebrae to a depth of 13 centimeters, collapsing his lung and causing fatal blood loss. Harris collapsed before help could arrive. The investigation quickly established what had happened. Annette stayed at the scene and told police she had been drunk, had missed her medication, and never intended to kill him. Detectives noted her high level of intoxication, but the evidence, her breach of a family violence order, and the sheer force of the wound left no doubt about her responsibility. Her trial in 2024 heard testimony about the couple's volatile relationship marked by dependence and repeated conflict. The defense argued it was an impulsive act, not premeditated murder, but the jury disagreed. They concluded that despite her personal struggles, Annette had made the deliberate decision to arm herself and use lethal force. She was found guilty of murder. On July 1, 2025, Annette Hancock was sentenced to 19 years in prison, backdated to March 2022. She will serve at least 10 years before being eligible for parole. The judge acknowledged her history of mental health and substance abuse, but emphasized the seriousness of her actions and the life that had been needlessly lost. The reflection of this case is not one of calculated evil or financial gain. It is the story of a woman consumed by addiction, instability, and emotional collapse. There were no elaborate plans, no grand deception, just two people trapped in a destructive relationship that ended in tragedy. For Benjamin Harris's family, the pain is permanent. For Annette Hancock, the next decade will be spent inside Tasmania's women's prison, reflecting on the moment her life and his unraveled beyond repair. From the cold precision of Catherine Birnie and her murderous pact with David, to the twisted fantasies of Jemma Lilley and Trudi Lenon, to the quiet betrayal of daughters like Natalie Maher and partners like Annette Hancock, each case reveals a different face of brutality. Some were driven by obsession, others by resentment, and some by sheer emotional collapse. Their victims were children, lovers, husbands, and even strangers who trusted the wrong person. What unites these stories is not just the violence itself, but the mask of normality that hid it. These women didn't look like killers. They lived in suburbs, attended church, raised children, and moved through everyday life unnoticed. And yet, behind closed doors, they crossed lines from which there was no return. Some, like Martha Rendell and Jean Lee before her, were executed for their crimes. Others, like Erin Patterson and Noelene Jordan, will spend the rest of their lives in prison. Their stories remind us of a hard truth. Evil does not always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it looks familiar. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it's the person you would never suspect. If these stories left you thinking, tell us in the comments, which case shocked you the most? And where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Your comments help this channel reach more true crime lovers, and I read every single one. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss our next deep dive into the crimes that shaped history. Some stories are too dark to forget. Thanks for watching, and stay safe.